Hello, dear friends. Before we begin, if you find this story worthwhile, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss similar stories. As you listen, if any part of this touches your heart, please leave a comment to share your thoughts with everyone. I love knowing that my stories are reaching people from all corners of the country. The 60s in Chicago was a time when the music of the Supremes drifted from kitchen radios. Fords rumbled down the streets, and housewives like Dorothy were expected to create what was called the perfect American home. Dorothy usually woke at 6 in the morning, when the sky was still veiled in a thin mist, and the distant sound of a train horn echoed. She would slip out of the double bed with its crisp white sheets, quietly draw the curtains to let the light in, and begin a familiar, repetitive series of tasks: boiling water for coffee, preparing toast, waking the children. Frank, her husband, would often linger in bed for a few more minutes, his breathing steady, as if nothing in the world was more urgent than sleep. "He works so hard," Dorothy would tell herself, a gentle smile gracing her lips. She always believed that a man who went out to earn a living, who brought money home to support his family, deserved a little extra rest. She never complained. That's what a good wife was supposed to do. Breakfast was a clatter of dishes and the clear laughter of children. Michael, the 13-year-old eldest, often acted more mature than his age. He'd pass the butter to his two younger sisters without needing a reminder from his mother. Dorothy watched, her heart filled with a warmth tinged with an indescribable pang of pain. She saw that her son was already used to making small sacrifices, and somewhere in her heart, a whisper reminded her, this child is learning to endure just like his mother. Frank entered the kitchen, adjusting his tie, the faint scent of aftershave lingering around him. He kissed Dorothy on the cheek, a gesture so familiar it felt more like habit than affection. Then, just like every other time, he slipped a thick envelope into his coat pocket, ready to be mailed. Dorothy never asked. She knew it was money for Elaine, his sickly sister in Indianapolis. From the earliest days of their marriage, Frank had spoken of Elaine as a family burden he couldn't forsake. "She's ill with no one to care for her. I'm the only family she has left," he once said, his voice full of responsibility. Dorothy had been moved to tears. A man who cared for his distant sister was an ideal husband, or so she believed. 14 years passed, and every month Frank sent a considerable sum. Sometimes, as Dorothy flipped through the expense ledger, looking at the meager amount left for their own family, a strange feeling stirred within her. The children had to wear hand-me-downs. She had to pinch every penny for milk, and the house was stained with peeling paint. Meanwhile, a woman she had never met lived on that money. "It's the right thing to do," Dorothy would whisper, as if to quell her own doubts. A wife was supposed to trust her husband. In this day and age, a man who provided for his family was rare enough, let alone one who was also responsible for his sister. So what right did she have to question it? But sometimes in the dead of night, listening to Frank's steady breathing beside her, Dorothy felt a silent void open in her heart. She couldn't understand why a sick sister would never write a thank you letter, never make a phone call, not even send a Christmas card. She also couldn't understand why Frank had never taken his wife and children to meet Elaine, not even once. A pang in the heart, that's what Dorothy called it. A fragile, vague feeling like a hairline crack on a seemingly perfect pane of glass. It was never big enough to make her doubt her marriage, but it was always there, waiting for the day it would shatter. She remembered one time Michael sat at his desk, his eyes on his math book, but his hands were trembling. "Mom, I don't need lunch. You can give my share to the girls." Dorothy hugged him, tears welling up. For a fleeting moment, she wanted to scream at Frank that it was enough, that their family needed to be a priority too. But she remained silent. A good wife didn't argue with her husband. A good mother knew how to swallow her tears to keep the family peace. That afternoon, Dorothy was alone in the kitchen, quietly mending one of Frank's frayed shirts. The repetitive sound of the needle piercing the fabric was like a prayer. She imagined Elaine, a hazy, unseen figure, lying somewhere in Indianapolis, thin sick, needing this money to live. She tried to plant a belief in her heart. Her own suffering would become a blessing for someone else. And so Dorothy continued to play the part of the devoted wife. She kept the house tidy, the children clean, and taught them to say grace before meals. Whenever the neighbors praised Frank as a responsible man, Dorothy would smile happily. Deep down, she believed her sacrifice was worthwhile, that her marriage was a testament to love and compassion. Yet sometimes, looking in the bedroom mirror, Dorothy would catch her own reflection, a woman in her early 30s, but whose eyes were already etched with weariness. And in that brief moment, she would hear a tiny, persistent whisper, "What if this is all just a perfect lie?" One early autumn morning in 1968, the air in the small house in suburban Chicago carried the scent of toast and black coffee. Dorothy had just dropped the kids off at school and returned to start cleaning the kitchen. The repetitive tasks kept her mind at ease, like a familiar, predictable tune. Frank had left for work early. He'd forgotten his gray jacket on the armchair in the living room. Dorothy picked it up, intending to hang it in the closet. Something stiff in the pocket made her pause. Usually, Frank's pockets only held his leather wallet, a ballpoint pen, and some loose change. Today, there was something else. She reached inside. Her fingers touched smooth, hard paper. A card. A fleeting smile crossed Dorothy's face. Maybe a colleague had given Frank a birthday card. He rarely boasted. Perhaps that's why he forgot to mention it. But when she opened it, the smile vanished. The neat handwriting, decorated in blue ink, was clear. "To our wonderful husband and father. Love, Elaine and Amanda." The blood in Dorothy's veins seemed to freeze. She read the words over and over, hoping she had misread them. But no, each letter was a dagger stabbing her eyes. Father, husband. Who is Amanda? And Elaine? The sick sister. Frank had sent money to for 14 years. Why would she call him her husband? The card trembled in her hand. Dorothy sank onto the chair, her chest tightening. Questions swirled in her head. How long had he been deceiving her? Could Elaine be? For a moment, she wanted to throw the card away to pretend she'd never seen it. But the truth, once it has gleamed, can never be extinguished. In the following days, Dorothy tried to live as if nothing had happened. She still prepared dinner, still smiled at the neighbors, still wiped dust from the bookshelves every morning. But inside, the suspicion grew larger, like a crack spreading across a wall. One afternoon, when Frank said he had a business trip to New York, Dorothy nodded as usual. But the very next morning, the kitchen phone rang. "Excuse me, is this Mr. Frank's residence?" a strange man's voice asked. "I'm calling from the trucking company." He forgot some documents for his Indianapolis shipment tomorrow. Dorothy's heart dropped to her stomach. Indianapolis, not New York. She managed to keep her voice calm. "Oh, yes, I'll pass on the message." When she hung up the phone, her hand was shaking violently. The pieces were starting to fit together. Elaine was in Indianapolis. Frank was taking business trips there. And now the card. Dorothy felt her body go limp. She collapsed onto a kitchen chair, her head in her hands. In the quiet room, the ticking of the wall clock suddenly sounded harsh, as if counting down to an unavoidable moment. That night, Dorothy couldn't sleep. She lay silently beside Frank, listening to his soft snores, and he felt like a complete stranger. The devoted husband she had trusted implicitly for 14 years now seemed like a dangerous unknown. As dawn broke, Dorothy made a bold decision. She would go to Indianapolis. She had to see the truth with her own eyes, no matter how cruel it might be. The Greyhound bus took nearly 5 hours. Dorothy carried a small handbag containing only a little money, a shawl, and the birthday card, the only proof she had. Through the window, the scenery flew by sprawling cornfields. Small towns with old signs, highways hazy with exhaust. Each scene was a reminder the world was vast, and her pain was just a tiny grain of sand. But in Dorothy's heart, that pain swelled, filling her entire chest. She thought of her children, of Michael with his thin shoulders already learning to bear responsibility, of her 2 little girls who loved to tie their hair with pink ribbons. If the truth came out, these children would be known as the children of a liar. The thought brought tears to her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. She had to be strong. In Indianapolis, Dorothy found the address from an envelope Frank had once written. It was a quiet street with neat red brick houses lined up in a row. She walked up to a house with a white picket fence, her heart pounding violently. The door opened just as Dorothy was about to knock. A slender, brown-haired woman appeared. She was holding a little girl of about 6 who had big, round eyes. "Excuse me, can I help you?" The woman's voice was gentle. Dorothy swallowed hard. "Ah, are you Elaine?" The woman paused for a second. "Yes, I'm Elaine, and you are." Their eyes met. In that instant, the entire truth was laid bare, without another word needing to be spoken. The little girl, Amanda, had the exact same blue eyes as Frank. Dorothy took a step back, as if she'd been slapped. Her whole body trembled, and she nearly dropped her handbag. Elaine clutched her daughter tighter, her gaze averting. "You're his wife, aren't you?" No one said anything more. There was no need. The heavy silence confirmed everything. Dorothy turned and walked away, her legs feeling like they had no strength. The world around her blurred through tears. She didn't remember how she got back to the bus station, only that when she sat down on the bus, her heart had shattered into 1,000 pieces. 14 years of marriage, all of it had been an elaborate lie. Dorothy returned to Chicago as night fell. The streetlights cast long shadows on the sidewalk, and the wind was chilling. She opened the door to her house and saw her 3 children fast asleep on the sofa, a blanket draped carelessly over them. Her heart clenched. Frank wasn't there. It seemed he had disappeared, along with the exposed truth. Dorothy sat down in the middle of the dark room, the card still in her hand, its folds now crumpled. She pressed it to her chest, tears streaming down her face. For the first time in her life, Dorothy no longer believed in love and marriage, in her own sacrifice. Everything had collapsed, and from that night on, her life turned to a completely new chapter. I'll never forget the day Frank disappeared. It wasn't a loud breakup. There were no final words, not even a note left behind. He left the house as if he were just going to buy a pack of cigarettes at the corner store, and then he never came back. At the time, I was 3 months pregnant. Morning sickness had me throwing up all morning, leaving me exhausted, but I still managed to take care of the 3 little ones. Their old shoes were worn through at the heels, and I patched them over and over with thick thread and scraps of leather. Meals revolved around mashed potatoes, corn soup, and the occasional bit of cured meat I could afford when I managed to save a few pennies. I thought the hard times would pass as long as Frank was there, as long as the family was together. I believed that, until the day that belief shattered like a mirror dropped on a cold tile floor. That afternoon, I remember I was folding laundry in the living room. Outside the window, the voices of neighborhood children echoed, while my own little ones sat on the rug, scribbling with worn-down colored pencils. Frank said he was going to meet a business associate in Chicago. I even packed him a small lunchbox, a couple of egg sandwiches with some pickles. He took it, smiled at me, and the door closed behind him. The next day, he didn't come home. I wasn't too worried. Unexpected trips were a common thing. But then, 2 days, 3 days, then a whole week passed. I called the trucking company where Frank said he had business. The man's voice on the other end was dry. "We have no one by the name of Frank working or partnering with us here, ma'am." My heart dropped into a cold, empty space. I rushed to check the drawer where Frank kept his pay envelope. It was empty. The bank I ran to the branch near our house, my pregnant belly swaying. The balance just a few cents, not even enough for a week's worth of groceries. He had cleaned it out. That night, I slumped onto the kitchen floor, hugging a pillow, choking back sobs. The children were fast asleep, their breathing even. I was afraid they would wake up and see me crying, afraid they would ask, "Where's Dad?" I had no idea how to answer. The following days, I lived like a shadow. I took the kids to school in the morning, scraped together pennies for food in the afternoon, and lay awake at night by the window, waiting for Frank's figure to appear at the end of the street. But he never returned. Instead, my belly grew bigger, and with it a crushing fear. How was I going to raise my children? One winter morning, the wind from Lake Michigan howled through the cracked window pane. I looked at my 3 little ones shivering in their thin coats, then at my own chapped hands from doing laundry for hire. And suddenly, my mother's voice echoed in my mind. My child, a single needle and thread can stitch a torn life back together. Never underestimate your own 2 hands. My mother, a woman from rural Indiana, had spent her entire life with a needle and an old sewing machine. She had taught me from the age of 10 how to keep a stitch straight, how to turn a scrap of fabric into a wearable dress. At the time, I just saw it as manual labor, never imagining that one day that very skill would save me and my children. I decided to try. At first, I took in mending jobs for the neighbors, a torn shirt cuff, a dress that needed to be taken in. They paid me a few cents. Some gave me a few vegetables. I sat for hours under an oil lamp, my pregnant belly in the way, my feet numb on the sewing machine pedal. But I felt alive, like I could still do something. I started hanging a small sign in the window. Clothing repair and mending cheap. The handwriting was shaky, but people started knocking on my door. Gradually, the name Dorothy spread throughout the neighborhood. With the pennies I scraped together, I bought more colored thread and a few yards of scrap fabric. I cut and sewed simple dresses for my daughters, rough canvas pants for my son. When the children wore their new clothes, their eyes lit up, and I realized that small joy was the strength that kept me going. But the path wasn't easy. I remember one time, while I was diligently sewing, a sharp cramp in my stomach made me collapse to the floor. I was terrified. I was having a miscarriage. A neighbor took me to the hospital, and the doctor said it was just from overwork. Lying in the hospital bed, tears streamed down my face. I felt both weak and selfish. I was letting my fear of loss make me forget that 3 other little ones needed food and clothing. Another day, a customer complained, "The stitching is so sloppy. You must not know what you're doing." My face flushed with shame and hurt. But after she left, I took a deep breath, unpicked every stitch, and started over. I told myself, no one is born perfect. Only hard work will help you stand on your own feet. My 3 children were my only support. My eldest, just 12, already knew how to watch his siblings and deliver the finished mending jobs to customers. My middle daughter, 9, would sit beside me patiently threading needles when my eyes blurred with fatigue. The youngest, only 5, would often hug my belly and whisper, "Mommy, is the baby hungry? I'll share my food." Those childish words both broke my heart and made it glow. They were the ones who reminded me that I couldn't give up. Frank could leave, but I couldn't. A year after Frank disappeared, I gave birth to my 4th child. It was a difficult birth, but we were both healthy. Holding the tiny, red-faced baby in my arms, I sobbed, not from pain, but from the knowledge that my responsibilities had just grown heavier. Yet at the same time, My sewing business began to pick up. The owner of a nearby laundromat started sending me piles of clothes that needed repairs. A teacher from my daughter's school ordered a few simple dresses to wear to class. Gradually, I saved up a little enough to buy a new sewing machine smaller, more compact, and it ran more smoothly. The feeling of turning the wheel of that new machine for the first time, hearing the rhythmic hum of the needle, sent a shiver down my spine. It felt like the whole room brightened, as if my own life was starting to move on a new track. Every evening after the children were asleep, I would sit alone at the machine. I'd stroke my calloused hands and whisper softly, "Frank, you can abandon us, but I won't let you take my children's future. I will sew, I will stitch, I will mend every torn piece you left behind. I will turn this pain into strength." The yellow lamplight cast my trembling shadow on the wall. But deep down, I knew from that moment on, a new Dorothy was born stronger, more resilient, and no longer dependent on anyone. One afternoon in March 1966, while I was diligently working at the new sewing machine I'd bought on installment, the phone rang. In the small house, the sound seemed to rip through the quiet atmosphere. I quickly wiped the sweat from my forehead and picked up the receiver. On the other end was a trembling voice, both strange and familiar. "Dorothy, it's me, Elaine." I froze. The name was like a knife twisting in an old wound. Elaine, the sickly sister Frank had sent money to for 14 years, the person I had imagined as a ghost, standing in the way of my family's happiness. Which Elaine, I tried to keep my voice steady, though my heart was pounding. Elaine, Amanda's mother. I had no other choice, Dorothy. Frank, he's gone. Both Amanda and we have nothing left. In that moment, instead of the rage I had anticipated, a quietness settled over me. Another victim, another woman abandoned just like me. We agreed to meet at a small cafe near Union Station in Chicago. I remember trembling as I pushed the door open, feeling a mix of anxiety and fear, unsure whether to see Elaine as an enemy or a fellow sufferer. Elaine was sitting in a corner. I recognized her immediately. The brown hair that was once curled was now disheveled, her eyes sunken from sleepless nights. Beside her was Amanda, a girl of about 13, wearing a worn-out sweater, clutching an old book to her chest, as if for dear life. When our eyes met, we were both silent. I felt like I was looking in a mirror, the exhaustion, the resentment, and a hint of desperation. He left us with debts and an apartment we're about to be evicted from. Elaine said softly. "I heard he left you, too. I don't expect forgiveness, but I have nowhere else to turn. I thought at least you would understand." I looked at Amanda, her eyes bright but full of anxiety. I thought of my own children, and suddenly the anger subsided. Frank had deceived us both. In that moment, I realized Elaine was not the culprit. She was just another victim. I invited Elaine and Amanda to my home. At first, my children reacted fiercely. Mom, why did you bring them here? They're the ones who took our dad away. I understood their resentment, but I held them close and whispered, Kids, your father betrayed all of us. But we can't let hatred turn us into cruel people. They need a roof over their heads, too. The first night, as Elaine and Amanda spread an old blanket on the floor, I lay listening to the wind whistling outside, my heart torn. But then I saw Amanda snuggle into her mother's side, trembling. The sight choked me up. I had held my own children just like that so many times. We were all just women trying to keep our families from falling apart. In the weeks that followed, the small house became crowded. It was awkward at first, but gradually Elaine started helping me with the sewing. She had surprisingly nimble hands. Every stitch was even and strong. We would sit side by side, the dim yellow oil lamp casting shadows of two silent figures, only occasionally exchanging a quiet word. One evening, after we finished a dress for a picky customer, Elaine looked up and gave a tired smile. Dorothy, do you think we could do more? Not just mending, but making and selling our own clothes. Maybe open a small shop. I was stunned. The thought had crossed my mind, but I never dared to believe I could do it. I was just a single mother of 4 who had been abandoned. But looking at Elaine, I saw a flicker of hope in her eyes, like a small light in a dark tunnel. And suddenly, I wanted to grasp it too. We pooled our meager savings, part from my mending money, part from Elaine selling some old jewelry. It was just enough to rent a tiny room on Halsted Street in an immigrant neighborhood. The walls were peeling, the ceiling leaked, but for us, it was a beginning. We repainted the walls with cheap paint and set up a few wooden racks to hang clothes. On the glass door, I shakily painted in white, New Beginnings. On opening day, it drizzled. No one came. I sat behind the counter, listening to the rain tap on the tin roof. My heart empty. Elaine quietly placed a hand on my shoulder. Don't worry, we've started. Beginnings are always hard, but at least this time, we're in control. Then a young mother with a small child stopped in. She pointed to a simple floral dress Elaine had made. How much? $4, I replied, my heart trembling. She nodded, paid, and then smiled. It's beautiful. I'll be back. When the customer left, Elaine and I hugged each other and burst into tears. It was only $4, but to us, it was proof that hope was real. One by one, customers came from poor working families, from immigrant girls needing a dress for church, to young men wanting a well-fitting vest. Word spread there were 2 skilled women who sold beautiful, affordable clothes. There were nights when, after closing the shop, we would sit and sip watered-down coffee. I looked at Elaine and was surprised to find I no longer felt jealousy. Instead, there was a strange empathy. We told each other stories about Frank, the times he lied the empty promises. And then we would laugh, a bitter laugh. The man who had once divided our 2 families was now just a distant shadow, while the very pain he caused had brought us together. Dorothy Elaine once whispered, "Maybe we lost 14 years because of him. But at least now we've found each other." I nodded, my eyes stinging. I never imagined that from the ashes of my marriage, a friendship, or rather a sisterhood so strong could emerge. The shop gradually prospered. We hired a few young girls from the neighborhood to help. My children and Amanda also pitched in. One would help with deliveries. Another learned to cut fabric. Another kept the books. The crowded house became one big, bustling, warm family. Whenever I saw the children sitting around the dinner table laughing and talking, my heart softened. They were no longer my kids or her kid. They were children under one roof, raised by the sweat of two mothers who chose to forgive and start over. New Beginnings wasn't just the name of a shop. It was a vow, a declaration, and proof that we could rebuild our lives despite betrayal and loss. In 1967, Chicago was in turmoil. On TV, I saw students protesting the Vietnam War. I saw civil rights marches. The world outside seemed to be changing drastically. But in the small room on Halsted Street, all I cared about was every stitch, every customer who walked through the creaky wooden door of New Beginnings. Every day, I woke up at 5. The first thing I did was make a simple breakfast, usually just toast, peanut butter, sometimes with a little sausage if we'd had a good sales day. My kids would eat and joke around Amanda sitting there too, her eyes sparkling. Elaine would already be busy ironing clothes for an urgent order. We were like a busy beehive. When I opened the shop, my heart still fluttered like it was the first day. Every customer who walked in felt like a miracle. Some days, we'd only sell 2 dresses, but other days, a dozen orders would keep us hunched over our work until late at night. Word spread quickly in the neighborhood. People said, "There are 2 mothers who opened a sewing shop. Their clothes are beautiful and affordable." Customers came and then referred their friends. One day, a young bride-to-be came in holding a picture of a wedding dress from a magazine. She timidly asked, "Could you make something like this, but cheaper?" Elaine and I looked at each other. It was the first time someone had ordered a wedding dress. We nodded. For the next 2 weeks, I meticulously sewed layer after layer of lace, while Elaine carefully crafted every seam. When the bride put on the dress and stood before the mirror in our tiny shop, I saw tears well up in her eyes. "It's more beautiful than the one in the magazine," she whispered. And after that, other brides started coming. Gradually, New Beginnings became the go-to place, not just for repairs, but for creating dresses for life's most important days. In the evenings, after the shop closed, the little house would light up again. 6 children sat around the study table. My 3, Elaine's Amanda, and the 2 little ones, playing with blocks on the floor. They fought over colored pencils, helped each other with reading, and argued occasionally, but always made up quickly. Once my youngest son, Peter, said innocently, "Amanda, do you think you're my real sister?" Elaine and I looked at each other, smiling through the sting in our eyes. Family bonds are nurtured by love. Even though we weren't related by blood, the children grew up like siblings. Of course, it wasn't always smooth. One time, our only sewing machine broke down completely. I remember that night, Elaine and I just sat there, staring at each other, with no idea where we'd get the money to fix it. Without the machine, the shop would be paralyzed. I even considered applying for a night shift at the nearby factory. But then, a regular customer, who happened to be a mechanic, heard the news and came by. He painstakingly took apart the machine, replacing a few parts with old ones from his own workshop. When the machine started running again, I burst into tears right there in my chair. He just smiled kindly. "You two have helped this whole neighborhood dress decently. This machine has to live on to keep serving." Financial struggles were a constant companion. Every month, we had to scrape together money for rent, electricity, and fabric supplies. But strangely, it was this scarcity that fueled our creativity. Leftover fabric was used to make handkerchiefs. Old lace was repurposed into new collars. Our customers appreciated that resourcefulness and thriftiness because it reflected their own lives. One spring day in 1969, a well-dressed woman walked into the shop. She introduced herself as the owner of a large department store downtown. She said she'd heard customers praising the two women on Halsted. She wanted to place a trial order for 24 dresses to sell in her store. I almost fainted from nervousness. 24. We had never made so many at once, but Elaine squeezed my hand, her eyes shining with determination. "We can do this." For 4 weeks, the entire family worked tirelessly. I sewed until my hands blistered. Elaine stayed up all night embroidering flowers. The kids helped too, cutting loose threads, folding dresses, and attaching labels. When we delivered the order, I felt like I was handing over my heart. A month later, the department store ordered another 24, and then more. It was a turning point. From a tiny shop, New Beginnings was starting to break into a larger market. With our growth, we also faced the curious stares of society. Neighbors would whisper, "How do those two women live together? What will happen to the children?" I heard them, but I no longer cared. I had endured the humiliation of being abandoned. I had risen from nothing. Now gossip couldn't bring me down. We held our heads high because we knew our work had real value. Every satisfied customer, every smile in a well-fitting dress that was clearer proof than any rumor. Some nights after closing the shop, Elaine and I would sit on the porch, watching the distant trains go by. I remember she once said, her voice somber, "If Frank was still here, we'd probably still be blind, each living in our own separate lies." I was silent. Though I didn't say it, I knew it was true. It was his betrayal that had set us free, that had given us a chance to be reborn. I looked at my calloused hands, hands that had trembled when I first held a needle. Now they had built a shop, a home, a small community. I felt a surge of pride, a feeling that 14 years as Frank's wife had never given me. By the end of the 60s, New Beginnings had 3 sewing machines, a small section for men's vests and customers or the surrounding neighborhoods. The children grew up to the sound of humming machines, the smell of new fabric, and quick meals full of laughter. One Christmas Eve, our entire family, 8 of us, crowded around a tiny Christmas tree. We hung handmade paper ornaments the kids had made. As we sang Silent Night, I saw Amanda holding Peter's hand, both with their eyes closed, humming along. The sight brought tears to my eyes. We didn't have a man in the house, but we had each other. And as it turned out, that was more than enough. The winter of 1971 came earlier than usual. Chicago was shrouded in a gray mist, and the wind from Lake Michigan cut into the skins like 1,000 tiny knives. I remember that day. Elaine came home from the clinic with her shawl wrapped tightly around her face as pale as ash. I knew immediately that something was wrong. In all the years we had been together, Elaine had never let her exhaustion show so clearly. She was always the pillar of strength, a mother, a partner, a sister. But that day, the light in her eyes seemed to have gone out. Dorothy, her voice was hoarse, the doctor said, I have a tumor in my lung. They think it's malignant. I stood frozen, my hands still covered in flour from preparing dinner. For a moment, the whole kitchen spun, and the sound of the children laughing in the living room seemed to be muffled by a thick wall of glass. The following days passed in a blur. Elaine had to undergo more tests, shuttling between the hospital and the shop. Every time I sat in a waiting room, I felt small and helpless. The long corridors with their flickering fluorescent lights, the sharp smell of antiseptic, it all seemed to trap us in a cruel reality. When the doctor confirmed stage 2 cancer with a possibility of metastasis, I heard the words, but couldn't process them. Elaine sat still, her hands clasped together. Only a single tear rolled down her cheek, very slowly, very heavily. That night, after the children were asleep, Elaine and I sat in the dark living room with only the faint yellow light from a corner lamp. She said, I'm not afraid of dying, Dorothy. I'm just afraid of leaving Amanda, of leaving the shop unfinished, of leaving you alone. I took her hand. It was thin and cold. We've been through so many storms. We'll get through this too. I promise. But in my heart, I knew how fragile that promise was. Chemotherapy began. Every time Elaine came home from the hospital, she was so weak she couldn't walk up the stairs on her own. I had to support her, listening to her ragged, broken breaths. Her thick, dark hair began to fall out, revealing a pale scalp. The children were confused. They asked me, Is Aunt Elaine very sick? I couldn't lie, but I didn't have the courage to tell the truth. The New Beginning shop became both a burden and a lifeline. We needed money for the hospital bills, but Elaine no longer had the strength to work. I took on most of the work myself, staying up all night, sewing, and in the morning, still having to care for the children and take Amanda to and from school. Some nights I would sit at the sewing machine and tears would just fall, staining the white fabric with small, dark spots. But our customers remained loyal. They kept coming. Some who heard about Elaine's illness would buy a few extra things just to support us. One old woman stopped by to have me mend a worn-out coat, then pressed a $5 bill into my hand. For Elaine's medicine, dear. In those difficult months, I realized something our sisterhood had transcended. Blood ties, even friendship. It was a kind of unspoken marriage pact without ceremony or papers. We had chosen each other in our most desperate moment, and now we were facing fate together. One evening, Elaine asked me to get a mirror and a comb. She wanted me to cut off the rest of her remaining hair. As I tremblingly made each snip, she looked straight in the mirror, then gave a weak smile. Now I look like one of those hippies on the street. Don't I? I laughed through my tears. In that moment, amidst the sound of the scissors and the dim yellow light, I saw she was still the strong, witty Elaine I had always known. Elaine started keeping a journal, not for herself, but for Amanda. She wrote down little stories how to make the chicken soup Amanda loved, how to choose fabric for a dress, and messages about love, kindness, and resilience. I would often see her diligently writing, her hand trembling, but her eyes focused, as if she wanted to pack up all her memories and love to leave behind. One night, she handed me a notebook. If I'm gone, Dorothy, promise me you'll give this to her. I couldn't speak. I just hugged her tightly. In the summer of 1970, Elaine grew much weaker. She couldn't walk much anymore, spending most of her time in bed, in the second-floor room, the window open to catch the rare breeze. The children and I took turns caring for her. Amanda grew up fast at only 14. Her eyes were much older, and she was always by her mother's side. On her last day, the weather was unusually hot. I sat by her bed, wiping the sweat from her brow. She held my hand, her breathing ragged. Dorothy, don't! Let the children lose their way. Keep the shop going. It's proof that our lives were not in vain. I nodded, choked with emotion. Then her hand went limp, a faint smile on her lips. The room fell silent. Elaine's funeral was simple but warm. Neighbors, customers, and friends all came to say goodbye. Everyone said she was a strong woman, an inspiration to the community. I stood by the coffin, no longer sobbing. My tears had run dry. Instead, I felt a deep resolve fill me. I had to keep my promise. I had to protect this shop and this family. That night, when it was just me and the children, Amanda sat quietly in my lap. She whispered, "Aunt Dorothy, Mom, will still be with us, right?" I stroked her hair and replied, "Yes, my love. Your mother left all her love here. We will carry on to make her proud." In the years that followed, New Beginnings stood strong. We opened a small branch, hired a few more seamstresses. Amanda grew into a young woman, following in her mother's footsteps in fashion design. The children grew up, each choosing their own path. But the memory of Elaine and our sisterhood became an invisible thread that held us all together. Every time I walked into the shop and looked at the wooden sign with the words, "New Beginnings," I would hear Elaine's voice in my head. This is proof that our lives were not in vain. And I would smile. Elaine was gone, but her legacy of love, strength, and the bond we shared lived on like a flame that would never go out. This year, I turned 76. Every morning, I still wake up early, open the window of my small second-floor room, and let the wind from Lake Michigan blow in carrying its salty, earthy scent. The New Beginnings shop is no longer the cramped little store we built from scraps of fabric long ago. It has become a stable business with several branches and even a small production workshop in the suburbs. I no longer sit at the sewing machine from dawn till dusk. Most of the work is now handled by Amanda and my children. I just offer my opinions, sometimes looking over the new designs Amanda excitedly brings me. But the habit of waking up early remains a habit from the hard years when every hour was as precious as gold. Amanda is now a woman in her 40s, with her own children and career. Every time I see her walk into the shop with her straight posture and bright eyes, I see a glimpse of Elaine, not just because she looks like her mother, but also in the way she smiles a smile that can wipe away the fatigue of a long day. Once Amanda brought me a dress she had designed herself. It was made of pale blue silk with a neat collar and exquisite stitching. She said, "Aunt Dorothy, this is the collection I'm preparing for next season. I'd love to hear your thoughts." I touched every seam, my fingers trembling with age, but my heart was joyful. I nodded. "You have your mother's hands, and her heart, too." Amanda smiled and hugged me tightly. In that moment, I felt that Elaine was still present, not through the old photograph hanging on the wall, but through the continuation of her daughter. My children and Amanda grew up together with no distinction of whose child is whose. Family dinner is still an unbreakable tradition. Every weekend, everyone gathers under the old roof, sharing chicken soup, mashed potatoes, and apple pie. The long table is filled with laughter, and the little ones run around. Sometimes I sit quietly observing the scene, my heart clenching with happiness. Who could have imagined that from a tragedy of betrayal, we would build such a warm, extended family? If Frank were alive somewhere and saw this, he probably wouldn't believe it either. But I no longer hold any resentment. Truly none. I have come to understand that Frank's betrayal, as painful as it was just a trigger. It was because of that explosion that Elaine and I found each other, that New Beginnings was born, and that our children were raised in a home of love. Old age comes with clear signs, slower steps, fading eyesight, a tremor in my hands when I hold a needle. I no longer have the strength to hold scissors and cut fabric. But I still love sitting by the second-floor window, where I can look down at the street and see customers coming and going from the shop. I write in a small notebook the little things of everyday life. How many dresses Amanda sold today? Which grandchild scraped their knee? Who brought a basket of apples as a gift? The words are crooked, the ink smudged, but for me, it's a way to hold on to life. In the evening, when the street lights come on, I often sit and remember the years gone by. I remember the small kitchen where I once stood, kneading bread dough, with tears of despair streaming down my face. I remember the old clattering sewing machine, where an entire empire began. I remember the nights with Elaine, counting every penny, then laughing at our dream of one day having a busy shop. It all plays back like a slow-motion film, both distant and vivid. If anyone were to ask me, "Do you have regrets for trusting Frank so blindly?" I would shake my head. I have no regrets, because it was that very naivety that led me on this journey. Without it, I might have just lived as a quiet wife in a small house, never knowing my own true strength. I'm no longer angry with Frank. At this age, resentment is meaningless. Instead, I feel gratitude. Gratitude, even for the betrayal that tore open the curtain, forcing me to stand up to live for myself and for my children. One afternoon, Amanda sat beside me and asked Aunt Dorothy if I were to write our story. Someday. Would you want me to mention Frank? I smiled. You should mention him, but don't make him the center. Let the center be love, forgiveness, and what we built. That is the true legacy. I want my children and the generations to come to understand that life can knock you down. It can take everything from you. But from those very ashes, you can build something new and beautiful. Now, every time I look in the mirror and see an old woman with white hair and wrinkled skin may no longer feel sad, because in those aged eyes there is still a gleam of pride. I have lived a full life. I have loved, endured, lost, forgiven, and created. Tonight, Amanda is setting the dinner table, and the grandchildren are chattering around me. On the table, there is an old photograph, Elaine and I standing in front of the shop on opening day, holding hands, our eyes bright with hope. Looking at that photo, I whisper softly, "We did not live in vain." Elaine, we left a legacy, and in my heart, a circle closes peaceful content and full of gratitude. If you found this story helpful, please like and subscribe to Porchlight Diaries so I can keep sharing. Comment where you're watching from and which part touched your heart. Maybe it'll send a little hope to someone who needs it today. Thank you for listening with such kindness